Hey folks, Mr. Howard here with the last installment on To Build a Fire. Just talking about some of the questions that you answered about theme, about allusions, about references to mythology and stuff like that. So we're writing two paragraphs, and the questions are as follows. One, who is the antagonist of the story? What is the conflict, and what theme or lesson is London trying to get across to the reader? Or two, in what ways is To Build a Fire similar in story structure, symbolism, and or theme to Greek myths such as Phaeton, Icarus, Prometheus, or others? I'm not picky. So let's handle the first of those. I got two dogs here. I tell you, they're just wandering around. But let's handle the first of those questions and talk about it. So who's the antagonist of the story? Almost everybody got that. The antagonist of the story is nature. Or cold, if you want to be more specific, the temperature. And he's trying to build a fire to defeat this adversary, hypothermia. You might call it hypothermia. That doesn't really matter. What's the conflict? I mean, on a basic level, the conflict is man versus nature. But the idea here is, can his intelligence, can his ingenuity, can his ability to alter the environment be victorious over the cold of nature? The answer is no, it can't. He dies in the end due to his own, misjudgments and mistakes and things like that. So, what theme or lesson is London trying to get across to the reader? Well, most of you answered that pretty well. Most of you looked at the idea of arrogance or hubris or pride. This guy got advice from a man at Sulphur Creek. He ignored that advice and he went off and went into nature when it was too cold for him to go into nature anyway. You can base this in a couple of ways. You can look at it and say, hey, the theme is don't ignore the advice of elders or people who are more wise than you. That's definitely a lesson that London is trying to teach through the antagonist being nature and the conflict that's going on. You could say, go with a friend. People are stronger in numbers. If he had brought somebody with him, that was a piece of advice that he ignored, he would have probably survived. And so you could talk about the importance of friendship and companions and not being alone in nature. Sure, I think that's a lesson that London's trying to get across as well. And then you could talk about the idea of don't be so prideful that you think you are better than nature. Human beings have this problem in general. We tend to think of ourselves as superior to natural environments and natural things, and ultimately that doesn't always work. And so, there's sort of three different ways you can go with that prompt if you identify the antagonist and the conflict, and then say, hey, what is London trying to teach here? And you could talk about multiple themes that come out of this situation in your paragraph as well. So that works fine. You could also look at the contrast of the man and the dog and how they work within the conflict of the story to teach things. The dog is more intelligent than the man in a lot of ways, and that comes across as well. So let's flip on to question 2 here for a second. Question 2, in what ways is To Build a Fire similar in story structure, symbolism, and or theme to Greek myths such as Icarus, Phaeton, or Prometheus? Or others, I'm not picky. There were some really good answers to this too. When people stop to think about it, they're like, wait a second, this story pretty much is the same thematically as Greek myths. And they say, hey, let's take a look at Icarus. In Icarus, you've got this kid Icarus, yeah. You got this kid Icarus who is flying around on wings, and he starts going up towards the sun, and his dad's like, don't do it! And he's so arrogant, he's like, yeah, I'm going to ignore your advice, I know better than you, Pops, okay, boomer. And he flies up to the sun where the wax melts on his wings, and he falls to his death. So he had advice, he ignored the advice, and he died. That's what happens in To Build a Fire. That he heard advice from an old man at Sulphur Creek, he ignored the advice, and he died. Same thing with Phaeton. Phaeton's like, hey, Pops, I want to fly your sun chariot. And Helios is like, you can't, you're not strong enough. Don't do it. And he's like, I'm doing it anyway. And he does it, and what happens? He dies. So we've got the same structure in both of those myths, where we've got a character who has hubris and arrogance and thinks they know better than people who are more knowledgeable and older than they are, and they go off and do it anyway, and they end up in this terrible situation. And so London is using a tried and true plot structure and thematic structure in his story, and a lot of you really nailed that in your paragraphs. Prometheus is a little more tricky. We know that this thing is called To Build a Fire. We know that Prometheus is responsible for giving fire to mankind. The connections with Prometheus are symbolic rather than plot-based. So when you or thematic, like the theme of Prometheus is he does sort of the right thing and gets punished for doing the right thing, and he becomes sort of a martyr. Whereas in this, the guy is using the gift of fire, if you will, the thing that separates civilization from nature. And you can see that separation of civilization and nature in the contrast between the man and the dog. The dog is with him for the fire. Not for who he is or anything like that. And the only way that he can survive in a cold, dark environment is the fire. It's what makes him able to survive despite his weak faculties. So in a lot of ways, it's substantiating the ideas of the Prometheus myth and fire as a symbol of civilization and safety and knowledge in the darkness, in the ignorance, in the cold, in the misery of the world. And so that would be your connection to Prometheus, not necessarily a straight plot-based connection or clear thematic connection. It's a symbolic connection. And I think London knows what he's doing here. I think clearly he's leaning on that Prometheus myth a little bit for some of the background of the story. So it's interesting that a story that's set in the Yukon that's very like North America, is at the same time very rooted in Greek mythology in a lot of ways, and there's a nice overlap there. So I'm going to read you some of the responses. We'll start with question 2 because that's fresh in your mind. I just talked about it. And I'll read you a few of the paragraphs your peers wrote. I'm picking the good ones. I think it's important that you have examples of writing done by your peers that is good writing, because we don't give you, hey, read this paragraph in response to this prompt. Like, that's not something you get or you see in real life. It's something that we make you do as teachers. But how are you expected to improve if you don't see examples of good writing to use to improve that? So I'm going to read you a few examples here. Just listen up. Think about how they make that assertion, that first sentence, what their claim is. Is it literary? What does it have to do with theme? What does it have to do with the author's intent? Look at the way they use quotations. How do they introduce their quotations? How do they give you adequate plot context and fit the quotation seamlessly into the paragraph structure? And then, how do they analyze the quotation? What's the analysis look like? What words are they looking at in that quotation? What are they doing with that quotation? How do they bring the theme out of that? And then how do they conclude it? How do they make it bigger than just, hey, this is an analysis of to build a fire? How do we make it relevant to real life and our day-to-day? How do we think about London's original audience and what it meant to them versus what it means to us as a modern audience? And these are all things to consider as you write your paragraph. Also, think about how they develop the paragraph. A lot of these are longer responses because you say more in a longer response than you do in a shorter response. So how do they develop it? How do they manage to find enough to say? Because a lot of people, they just sort of cut it short. Especially if you're writing like a five sentence response. You've got your assertion, which is a sentence, and you've got an introduction to a quote, which is a sentence. You got a quote, which is a sentence. You got one sentence of analysis, and then you're on to your conclusion. You're just rushing through when you're not developing any of your points. And a lot of these answers develop points adequately. So use them as an example with your own thinking, with your own writing, and hopefully that will help you. All right. So I'm just going to read a couple. I'm not going to name names. If you hear yours, congratulations. If you don't worry about it. To build a fire is similar to the Greek myths, the fall of Icarus and Phaeton and the Sun Chariot. They have the same theme about how one's hubris can lead to death. In each story, the protagonist is given advice, but they don't listen to the advice, and they end up getting killed. In To Build a Fire, the old man on Sulphur Creek said, quote, "No man should travel alone in that country after 50 below zero." London, 72. The unnamed protagonist does not listen to and tries to travel alone. As he travels, he gets his feet wet and he starts to freeze. So he decides to build a fire. The fire was successful for a while, but he built it under a tree with snow in it. The snow fell and the fire was put out. At this moment, the protagonist thinks to himself, quote, "Perhaps the old man on Sulphur Creek was right. If he had a companion on the trail, he would be in no danger now." End quote. London, 73. The unnamed man tries to build more fires, but he becomes more unsuccessful with each fire. Finally, the unnamed man lies down to die in the cold, in regret, murmuring to the old man at Sulphur Creek, quote, "You were right, old fellow, you were right." End quote. London, 79. In the fall of Icarus, Daedalus warned Icarus not to fly too close to the sun, or else the wax on his wings would melt and Icarus would fall and die. Icarus, in his own hubris, decides to fly high, and the wax melts. Icarus falls to his death. In Phaeton and the Sun Chariot, Phaeton asks Helios to drive his chariot. Helios warns Phaeton that the horses on the chariot can only be controlled by Helios himself, but Phaeton does not care and tries to drive the chariot anyway. The horses go berserk and burn the earth, so Zeus strikes the chariot down and Phaeton falls to his death. In each story, the protagonist was given advice, but they refused to listen, and they died. If they had listened, they would not have died, supporting the theme that one's overconfidence and arrogance can and will lead to death. Solid paragraph. Good use of quotation. Picks 3 quotes that are all related to each other, puts them in order, and makes analysis. So good stuff there. Here's another on the same topic. In the story To Build a Fire, written by Jack London, distinct similarities can be seen regarding the popular Greek mythological stories of Prometheus and Icarus. More specifically, similar symbolism within the story of Prometheus and similar themes with the story of Icarus. This tale helps make these themes and examples of symbolism more relatable than they would necessarily be to someone who is reading them strictly from Greek mythology, where they're typically conveyed using ideas, powers, or gadgets that are completely out of the realm of things that may be possible for humans to create or use within the next 1,000 of years. In the story of Prometheus, humans are living in a world of darkness, plagued with disease, hunger, and war, when Prometheus, against Zeus's orders, shows man how to create fire. This fire represents hope and knowledge, and allows humans to exit the dark age they have been living in and start to create the world we know today. The fire representing hope makes an appearance in To Build a Fire as well. When the main character accidentally soaks his lower legs in the water, building a fire is his only chance for survival. Quote, "When it is 75 below zero, a man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire. This is especially true if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile and keep his blood moving. But the blood in wet and freezing feet cannot be kept moving by running when it is 75 degrees below." London 71. Making a fire is the main character's only chance of survival. It represents hope, just as the fire in Prometheus story does. Both fires symbolize hope for survival and a better future. Unfortunately, in To Build a Fire, the main character doesn't survive due to his cockiness and pride. These 2 character traits, cockiness and pride, relate to the tale of the story of Icarus. 2 prominent themes in the story of Icarus are not to become too prideful and to listen to elders' advice. In the story of Icarus, Icarus becomes too prideful that he doesn't listen to his father's advice, and he soon dies because of it. In To Build a Fire, the main character ignores a wise man's advice, and when he thinks he's safe, starts to become joyful and prideful that he did fine without it. Soon after this, he dies. However, he would have survived if he had set his ego aside and taken the man's advice. Quote, "He remembered the advice of the old man on Sulphur Creek and smiled. The man had been very serious when he had said that no man should travel alone in the country after 50 below zero. Well, here he was. He had had the accident, he was alone, and he had saved himself. Those old men were rather womanish," he thought. London 72. This man set aside a wiser older man's advice due to his own ego and overconfidence. Even after he had a near-death experience, he only became more prideful that he had not taken the man's advice, and when he was gloating, he lost his focus, and some falling snow put his fire out. Without the fire to warm him, he eventually froze to death. London is warning the reader about becoming too prideful, and that one day it might kill you. The symbol of hope in Prometheus and the themes of listening to elders and keeping your ego in check from Icarus can both easily be identified in the short story To Build a Fire. London does this to reiterate these themes and make them more relatable for people who have read the Greek myths already, and to introduce them to people who haven't read the Greek myths yet. Overall, London is helping to spread these important symbols and themes. Okay, I'm going to stop this video and start another one with 2 more responses.